One vehicle, one crew, one window of vulnerability. That is all it took. A Russian Pantsir-S1 air defense system, one of Moscow's most capable point defense platforms, built to protect armored formations from exactly the kind of precision strikes Ukraine has been running across the Eastern Front, sat forward of its infantry screen during a routine shift rotation. Its radar was cold. Its crew was mid-transfer. The gap between the outgoing crew and the incoming team was exactly 47 minutes. Ukrainian military intelligence knew about every one of those 47 minutes. What followed was not a battle. It was not a firefight. It was a precision extraction executed with the cold, methodical competence that has come to define Ukraine's special operations forces in this war. By the time Russian commanders understood what had happened, the Pantsir-S1, complete with its surveillance radar, missile launchers, onboard codebooks, and electronic warfare modules, was already rolling west across frozen ground toward the Ukrainian border. Intact, operational, and extraordinarily valuable. I'm your host at Conflict East, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're breaking down one of the most audacious special operations of this conflict, a GUR Intelligence Directorate snatch mission that didn't just capture a piece of Russian hardware. It captured the electronic brain of Russia's entire integrated air defense architecture. Because here is what most reporting missed about this operation. The Pantsir-S1 itself, worth roughly $14 million on the open defense market, was almost secondary to what was inside it. Inside that vehicle were the IFF transponder codes that Russian aircraft used to identify themselves to their own air defense network. Inside were the radar waveform libraries, the precise electromagnetic signatures Pantsir uses to track incoming missiles. Inside were the missile guidance parameters telling a Pantsir operator exactly how to engage a Storm Shadow or a HIMARS rocket at specific altitudes and velocities. Every one of those parameters is now in Western hands. Every waveform signature, every guidance algorithm, every IFF code. The implications for every future strike Ukraine and its NATO partners conduct against Russian air defense systems are difficult to overstate. But before we get to the strategic aftermath, we need to understand how a team of Ukrainian special operators pulled off an extraction that most military planners would have dismissed as impossible. Let's go back to the beginning. The Kursk salient had been contested for months before this operation. Ukrainian forces had pushed into Kursk Oblast in a surprise offensive that shocked Moscow and demonstrated something the Kremlin had been desperate to deny, that Ukrainian forces could operate offensively on Russian soil, hold territory there, and use that foothold to reshape the tactical picture across the entire northern front. Russian command responded by flooding the salient with forces. Multiple brigades rotated through the area in overlapping cycles, creating exactly the organizational churn GUR was looking for. When units rotate, there are seams. When brigades hand off sectors, there are gaps in coverage. When shift changes happen at the crew level, there are windows. GUR had been studying those windows for weeks. The intelligence picture assembled by Ukrainian analysts was extraordinarily detailed. Satellite imagery provided by allied intelligence partners, combined with persistent drone surveillance flown by Ukrainian reconnaissance assets at altitudes carefully calibrated to avoid triggering Russian air defense sensors, had built a comprehensive map of Russian air defense positions throughout the salient. Every Pantsir, every Tor, every man-portable air defense team. Their locations, their patrol patterns, their maintenance cycles, their crew rotation schedules. Which weapon system was providing the most dangerous coverage to Russian ground forces in the salient? Was it the Pantsir-S1, the Tor M2, or the Buk M2? Which platform posed the greatest threat to Ukrainian air assets operating in support of the operation? Drop your analysis in the comments. The answer, according to Ukrainian targeting officers, was consistently the Pantsir-S1. The system's dual-mode engagement capability, radar-guided missiles combined with a 30mm autocannon for close-in defense, made it the most versatile threat in the Russian inventory against the low-altitude drone operations Ukraine depends on. Every Pantsir destroyed or captured degraded the coverage umbrella protecting Russian ground forces. Capturing one intact was a different proposition entirely. The specific Pantsir-S1 targeted by this operation had been positioned approximately 4 kilometers forward of the nearest Russian infantry positions, in a tree line flanking a secondary road that Russian logistics convoys used during nighttime resupply runs. Its forward positioning was a deliberate Russian tactical choice, keeping air defense assets close to the forces they protected rather than buried deeper in the rear where Ukrainian deep strikes were more frequent. That choice created the vulnerability. 4 kilometers of open ground between the Pantsir and its nearest infantry support. A crew rotation that happened on a predictable schedule. Predictable enough that GUR analysts had documented it across multiple cycles before the mission was ever authorized. and a 47-minute window during shift changes when the system was neither fully operational nor manned at combat strength. The GUR cell selected for this mission was a 12-man element from what Ukrainian defense sources describe as a deep penetration special operations unit with extensive experience operating behind Russian lines in Kursk Oblast. These were not soldiers improvising on the fly. They had been inside Russian-controlled territory before. Several operators had conducted multiple prior penetrations of the salient. They knew the terrain, knew the Russian patrol patterns, knew the electronic warfare environment they would be operating in. 3 weeks before the mission, a preliminary reconnaissance element moved into the operational area. 2 operators. No vehicles. Insertion by foot across a seam between 2 Russian brigade sectors. A 2-kilometer gap in sensor coverage that GUR had identified through careful analysis of Russian electronic emissions. The reconnaissance team spent 4 days in the operational area. They confirmed the crew rotation timing. They mapped the vehicle's exact position and orientation, critical for the extraction plan. They documented the approach routes and potential obstacles. And they found something that almost ended the mission before it began. A secondary Russian observation post had been established approximately 600 meters from the Pantsir's position. A post that hadn't appeared in satellite imagery because it was established after the last satellite pass. 2 soldiers, a single DHK heavy machine gun, a radio. That observation post covered the most direct extraction route. The reconnaissance team transmitted their findings back to GUR command. The mission planning team spent 48 hours revising the extraction plan. The direct route was abandoned. An alternative was calculated. Longer, more exposed to potential aerial observation, but outside the observation post's field of fire. The additional distance added approximately 23 minutes to the extraction timeline. 23 minutes that would prove consequential. The mission launched on a moonless night. Temperature minus 11 degrees Celsius. Ground frozen solid, which mattered because the Pantsir-S1 sits on a wheeled chassis, and frozen ground meant the vehicle could be driven across terrain that would have been impassable mud in warmer conditions. The 12-man cell crossed the brigade seam at 11:52 p.m. 4 operators went forward as the assault element. Their task was the Pantsir crew. 4 operators formed the security perimeter, covering approach routes and providing early warning. 2 operators were assigned to the vehicle itself. Their job was to get the Pantsir running and keep it running for the entire extraction. 2 operators maintained communications and drone coverage. The drones were essential. 2 Ukrainian FPV-modified reconnaissance drones operating on encrypted frequencies circled the operational area at altitudes below Russian radar coverage, approximately 40 meters above ground level. The drone operators, positioned at a forward staging point 4 kilometers to the west, had real-time thermal imagery of every Russian movement within a 2-kilometer radius of the target. If a Russian patrol moved toward the operation, the assault element would know about it with enough lead time to adapt. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes destroys Russia's electronic security posture across the entire northern air defense zone. The crew rotation began at 1:17 a.m., precisely as GUR's pattern analysis had predicted. The outgoing crew, 5 personnel, began the handover process with the incoming crew of 4. During shift transitions, Russian air defense crews typically conducted a formal handover that included a walk-around inspection of the vehicle, a briefing on any incidents or alerts during the previous watch, and a signing of operational logs. The entire process typically ran between 30 and 50 minutes. GUR assault teams had trained on exactly this timeline. At 1:34 a.m., with the shift change in progress and both crews partially occupied with the handover, the assault element moved. 4 operators crossing open ground at a low crawl, using a shallow drainage ditch that ran to within 80 meters of the Pantsir's position. Thermal suppression suits, gear that significantly reduces infrared signature, kept them invisible to any Russian thermal observation watching the area. The frozen ground was silent under their movement. No mud, no crunch of frozen leaves, just distant artillery somewhere to the south and the wind. At 1:41 a.m., the assault element reached the drainage ditch's endpoint, 80 meters of open ground. No cover. The Pantsir crew was visible through the assault element's night vision. 7 personnel standing around the vehicle, 2 of them inside the crew compartment conducting the electronic handover of system status. The conversation was audible at this distance. The assault element waited. At 1:43 a.m., 3 of the Russian crew members walked to the far side of the vehicle to smoke, a routine that GUR's reconnaissance had documented as consistent behavior during shift transitions. The smoking cluster put them around a blind corner from the assault element's position. The remaining 4 crew members were at the rear of the vehicle, focused on the paperwork portion of the handover. The assault element moved. The takedown lasted approximately 90 seconds. Sedation munitions. chemical agent delivery systems that Ukrainian SOF has used in previous behind-the-lines operations, were deployed against the crew members at the rear of the vehicle simultaneously with the assault element reaching the smoking group around the front. The sedation approach was deliberate. Ukrainian planners had made a specific decision. Crew members rendered unconscious could not trigger any emergency alert protocols. A Pantsir crew that encounters armed attackers might have time to transmit a contact report. A crew already unconscious before they realize anything is wrong cannot. All 7 Russian crew members were down within 90 seconds of the assault beginning. The technical operators moved immediately to the vehicle. The Pantsir-S1 they were working on was a 2019 production variant. They had studied the crew manuals, obtained through prior intelligence operations, and had practiced on a Pantsir-S1 shell that GUR had assembled from components captured in previous operations. Starting the vehicle took 4 minutes. The vehicle's onboard computer required a manual override sequence that the operators had memorized across hundreds of practice repetitions. Subscribe to Conflict East if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. At 1:51 a.m., 8 minutes after the takedown began, the Pantsir-S1 was rolling west. The extraction route ran approximately 14 kilometers to the border crossing point, a section of the frontier that Ukrainian engineers had identified as passable for a wheeled vehicle of the Pantsir's dimensions and weight. The route crossed 2 secondary roads, skirted the eastern edge of a forested area where Russian signals intelligence equipment had been previously detected, and passed within approximately 900 meters of an active Russian logistics hub. That logistics hub was the mission's greatest risk. The drone coverage team had been tracking activity at the hub throughout the night. As the extraction column, the Pantsir moving at approximately 35 kilometers per hour, followed by the security element in 2 captured Russian military vehicles that GUR had pre-positioned in the operational area, approached the 900-meter closest point to the hub. Drone operators reported increased activity. A Russian resupply convoy had arrived at the hub approximately 20 minutes earlier than the pattern analysis had predicted. 40 vehicles, approximately 200 personnel, logistics personnel and their security detachment. The extraction column stopped. 11 minutes. Stationary. 890 meters from a Russian logistics hub with 200 personnel in a vehicle that would be immediately recognizable to any Russian soldier who looked in the right direction. This was the obstacle GUR's planners had feared most. Not a combat engagement, but a timing collision between the extraction and routine Russian logistics operations happening exactly where they needed to pass. The mission commander had 3 options. Wait for the convoy to clear the hub and risk the shift change anomaly being discovered, attempt to bypass the hub using a longer route that had not been fully reconnaissance cleared, or push through at maximum speed and hope the darkness and the Russian vehicle markings on the extraction column's support vehicles were enough. The mission commander chose to wait. 11 minutes at a standstill. Drone operators watched the logistics hub. Security element personnel watched the approach routes. The Pantsir sat dark and quiet, its radar cold, its crew unconscious in the drainage ditch 14 kilometers back. At 2:19 a.m., the logistics convoy completed its offload and began moving east, away from the extraction route. The column moved. At 2:44 a.m., the Pantsir-S1 crossed the frontier, intact. The mission from insertion to border crossing had taken 2 hours and 52 minutes, 23 minutes longer than the original plan, due to the observation post discovery and the logistics convoy delay. Both delays had been absorbed by the planning buffer that GUR's mission designers had built into the timeline precisely because operations behind Russian lines never go exactly according to plan. The recovered crew members, the Russian soldiers rendered unconscious during the takedown, were left in the drainage ditch with their weapons stacked nearby. They were not harmed. They were discovered by a Russian patrol approximately 3 hours after the extraction column crossed the border. By that point, the Pantsir was already at a GUR forward assessment point, and Western intelligence technicians were beginning the process of exploiting the vehicle's electronics. What those technicians found exceeded even optimistic pre-mission expectations. How many distinct electronic warfare systems did Western intelligence extract data from inside the captured Pantsir-S1? A 4B7C12. The answer is coming at the end of this analysis. Think carefully. The number matters. The Pantsir-S1 that GUR brought across the border was not a stripped or degraded system. It was fully operational. Fuel tanks at 60% capacity. Missile launchers loaded with 12 5.7E6 E-missiles, both 2A38 M30mm autocannons functional and loaded, and, most critically, its onboard computer systems entirely intact, with no indication that any emergency data wipe protocol had been triggered before the crew was taken down. The IFF transponder database alone was described by analysts familiar with the exploitation as extraordinarily valuable. IFF. Identification friend or foe is the electronic system that prevents air defense units from shooting down their own aircraft. Every Russian aircraft operating over the front carries IFF transponders broadcasting specific coded signals. Russian air defense systems are programmed to recognize those codes and withhold fire. Capturing those codes means Ukrainian and NATO mission planners can now program decoys, false signatures, and electronic spoofing tools to generate phantom IFF signatures that will confuse Russian air defense operators. But the IFF codes were only the beginning. The Pantsir-S1's radar tracks targets using specific electromagnetic waveforms, precise frequency patterns, pulse repetition intervals, and beam steering sequences unique to this system. Those waveforms are classified at the highest levels of the Russian defense establishment. Western intelligence agencies had previously obtained partial waveform data from destroyed Pantsir systems, data recovered from burned-out electronics and combat damage assessments. Partial data. Fragments. This was the complete library. Complete tracking waveforms mean Western defense scientists can now design Storm Shadow and HIMARS trajectory profiles specifically optimized to exploit the gaps and latencies in Pantsir's tracking capabilities. They can program missiles to approach at angles and velocities that maximize the time the Pantsir's fire control computer spends in tracking lock acquisition mode, the brief window when the system is most vulnerable to saturation attacks or countermeasure deployment. Every Storm Shadow mission that Ukrainian and NATO planners execute against Russian air defense positions from this point forward will be shaped by what was inside that vehicle. If you believe tactics win wars, type Conflict East in the comments. The Pantsir-S1's missile guidance parameters were equally revealing. The 57E6 E-missile uses a command-guided flight profile. The missile flies according to instructions continuously transmitted from the Pantsir's fire control system from launch to impact. Those command signals use encrypted frequency-hopping communications. Western intelligence had estimates of the frequency-hopping patterns. Now they had the actual parameters, the exact hop sequences, the exact encryption timing, the exact command signal format. Designing electronic jamming systems to disrupt Pantsir missile guidance just became significantly more tractable. Ukrainian defense sources, speaking carefully and without specific operational detail, confirmed to analysts covering this story that the exploitation of the captured system had already influenced mission planning for multiple subsequent operations. Storm Shadow employment profiles had been updated. HIMARS approach corridors had been modified. Air defense suppression mission plans for potential future operations had been revised to incorporate the new knowledge. The operational ripples from one 47-minute vulnerability window were spreading outward across the entire theater. But there was a dimension to this operation that went beyond immediate tactical and technical exploitation. There was the matter of what the capture communicated to Russian commanders, and the cascading effects that communication produced on Russian air defense doctrine across the entire front. Russian military command received confirmation of the Pantsir's capture approximately 6 hours after the extraction. The confirmation came not from the recovered crew members, who were medically evaluated, debriefed, and eventually processed through military justice procedures for the loss of equipment, but from satellite imagery showing the unmistakable tire tracks of a Pantsir-S1 heading west across the frontier. The immediate Russian response was predictable. All Pantsir-S1 systems operating in the Kursk salient were ordered pulled back from their forward positions to positions at least 8 kilometers behind the nearest infantry screen. Crew rotation schedules were changed. Shift handover procedures were revised to prohibit any period during which the system was unmanned or operating below combat readiness. What NATO analysts describe as capture anxiety, a doctrinal adaptation driven by fear of losing additional intact systems, had taken hold in Russian air defense planning. The pullback of Pantsir systems from forward positions had an immediate and measurable effect on Ukrainian air operations in the salient. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones that had previously been operating at low altitude with approximately 40% risk of Pantsir engagement were now operating in airspace where the nearest Pantsir was 8 to 12 kilometers back. Beyond effective engagement range for the low-altitude profiles Ukrainian operators prefer. Ukrainian strike drones reported significantly reduced engagement attempts in the weeks following the operation. The ground had changed. One vehicle, one crew, one window of vulnerability. And the entire air defense architecture of the Russian force in Kursk Oblast had been tactically degraded. What would NATO have done differently with equivalent intelligence? Could conventional military planning have extracted the same intelligence value through electronic interception rather than physical capture? Comment your analysis. This is the moment to examine what made this operation possible, and what Russian command failures enabled it. Intelligence operations of this magnitude don't succeed in a vacuum. They succeed because their opponents create the conditions for success through doctrinal rigidity, organizational inertia, and a persistent underestimation of enemy capabilities. Russian air defense deployment doctrine in the Kursk salient prioritized tactical utility over security. The decision to position Pantsir systems forward, close to the forces they protected, was militarily logical, but it prioritized one risk while creating another. Russian planners accounted for the risk of losing Pantsir systems to Ukrainian deep strikes and mitigated that risk by keeping the systems mobile and dispersed. They failed to account for the risk of physical capture, a risk that seemed fantastical until GUR demonstrated it was not. This is a recurring failure pattern in Russian military thinking during this conflict. Ukrainian forces consistently exploit the gap between what Russian commanders consider credible threats and what Ukrainian special operators are actually willing to attempt. The crossing of the Dnipro under fire, the drone boat raids on Sevastopol harbor, the Kursk incursion itself. Each of these operations was dismissed as too risky, too ambitious, or simply too audacious by analysts who underestimated Ukrainian willingness to accept tactical risk in pursuit of strategic advantage. The Pantsir capture follows this same pattern. It was not a lucky break. It was the product of meticulous intelligence work, precise mission planning, extensive rehearsal, and a willingness to attempt an operation that conventional military risk assessment would have flagged as too dangerous to authorize. Ukrainian special operators went into the gap between two Russian brigades, in the dark, in sub-zero temperatures, and drove a $14 million Russian air defense system across the border. Because they had planned for exactly this. Because they had trained for exactly this. Because their intelligence picture was detailed enough that they understood the 47-minute window better than the Russian commanders who had created it. Tactical preparation defeats tactical improvisation, every time. The broader lessons of this operation are already reshaping Ukrainian special operations doctrine and, according to sources familiar with Allied planning discussions, influencing how NATO special operations forces think about behind-the-lines hardware exploitation missions, targeting air defense systems not for destruction but for capture. Harvesting their electronic intelligence rather than simply removing them from the battlefield, is a doctrinal evolution that the Pantsir operation has demonstrated is operationally viable. The technical exploitation value of an intact air defense system exceeds the tactical value of destroying it. A destroyed Pantsir removes one system from the Russian order of battle. An intact Pantsir gives Western engineers the complete technical architecture of the system. Architecture that can be used to defeat every Pantsir in Russian inventory, everywhere, indefinitely. Do you think the strategic value of this capture outweighs the operational risk GUR accepted to execute it? Or should special forces be reserved for higher certainty missions? The question isn't simple. Comment your reasoning. Now to the question posed earlier in this analysis. How many distinct electronic warfare systems did Western intelligence extract data from inside the captured Pantsir-S1? The answer is 7. The 1RS-2E surveillance radar, the 1RS-1 1E tracking and targeting radar, the IFF transponder system, the missile fire control computer, the 57E6E missile guidance transmitter, the 2A38M fire control system, and the vehicle's encrypted communications suite, a component that, while technically a communication system rather than a weapons system, provided Western signals intelligence analysts with direct access to the encrypted protocols used by Russian tactical air defense networks to communicate with higher command. 7 systems, 7 complete technical datasets, each one contributing to a different layer of the Western intelligence picture of Russian integrated air defense architecture. The operation validated the concept. The intelligence haul justified the risk. The tactical outcome, degraded Russian air defense coverage in the salient, provided immediate battlefield benefit. The strategic outcome, a comprehensive technical exploitation that will shape missile employment profiles for years, represents a contribution to Ukrainian and Allied military capability that no amount of drone strikes or artillery could have replicated. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East. 3 questions this operation demands you consider. Was the mission commander's decision to wait 11 minutes at a standstill, with the entire operation exposed within 900 meters of an active Russian logistics hub, the correct tactical choice? Or should the column have pushed through at speed and accepted the risk of visual identification? Could Russian Air Defense Command have prevented this capture through doctrinal changes that didn't compromise the tactical positioning that makes Pantsir systems effective in the forward area? And if so, why hadn't those changes been implemented? If you were commanding a NATO special operations element with the same intelligence picture GUR had, what would you have done differently? Think carefully about those questions. They are not hypothetical. They are the actual planning problems that special operations commanders on both sides of this conflict are working through right now, on the same front lines, with the same tools and the same human intelligence, making decisions that will shape the next phase of this war. Subscribe to Conflict East, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Kursk salient is quieter now than it was on the night this operation executed. Russian air defense positions have repositioned. New crew protocols are in place. The gap between the brigades has been reinforced. But somewhere in a Western intelligence facility, engineers are still working through the complete technical architecture of Russian Pantsir-S1 air defense. Every waveform, every frequency, every guidance parameter captured intact on a frozen night in Russian territory. The wrecks aren't always visible. Sometimes the most consequential damage leaves no physical trace at all. Stay vigilant.